The first thing Ambassador Vea Solen did when she saw her assigned human guard was laugh. Not a polite laugh, not a nervous laugh. A full, unrestrained sound that rippled through the reception hall of Conclave Station Muron like wind through tall grass, drawing heads, turning eyes, causing the 6 Delvari attendants behind her to exchange glances with the particular kind of controlled discomfort that means our boss just did something embarrassing, and we're pretending we didn't see it. She laughed because he was small. That's the honest truth of it. I was standing maybe 40 feet away, near the eastern archway with my media credentials clipped to my jacket, and I watched the whole thing unfold the way you watch a slow-motion accident. The kind where you can see exactly what's about to happen, but you can't stop it, and you can't look away. His name, I found out later, was Sergeant Davin Reyes. He was standing at the bottom of the arrival ramp when the ambassador's transport docked, which meant he was the first thing she saw when she stepped off. Protocol. Standard diplomatic greeting formation. The honor guard position is always the senior security officer, and Sergeant Reyes was exactly that. He was average height for a human, maybe 1.8 meters, lean, not bulky. Dark skin, close-cropped hair, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something harder than bone. He was wearing the standard-issue Sec Corps tactical uniform, charcoal gray, no insignia except the rank pins on the collar, nothing decorative, nothing flashy. He had a sidearm at his hip and a secondary blade strapped to his thigh, and he was standing completely, perfectly still in the way that only comes from years of training. And Ambassador Vea Solen, who stood at 2.4 meters in her natural form, whose species the Delvari had luminescent bone ridges running along their skulls and triple-jointed fingers and eyes that shifted color with mood, looked at this human standing at the bottom of her arrival ramp, and she laughed. I caught it all on the recording sensor I had running in my bag, played it back 100 times. You can see the exact moment it happens. She steps off the ramp, sees him, and something crosses her face, a flicker of expectation, like she was waiting to see the actual honor guard, and then that flicker curdling into amusement when she realized, no, this is it, this is the one, this small, quiet thing in gray is supposed to be protecting her. The laugh lasted maybe 4 seconds. She covered her mouth, a Delvari gesture of courtesy, even when they're not being particularly courteous, and collected herself. Her attendants pretended to study the ceiling. Sergeant Reyes didn't move. Not a flinch, not a tightening of the jaw, not a single muscle shift in his face. He just stood there, hands clasped behind his back, eyes tracking the room the way a predator tracks movement. Not rudely, not aggressively, just constantly, efficiently, the way someone does when keeping track of threats is as natural as breathing. He let her laugh, he waited for her to finish, and then he said with perfect calm, "Ambassador Solen, welcome to Muron Station. I'm Sergeant Reyes, Sec Corps Division 7. I'll be your primary security contact for the duration of the summit. If you'll follow me, I'll walk you through the station's threat assessment and emergency protocols before we proceed to your quarters." No acknowledgement of the laugh. No stiffness, no wounded dignity, just the job, stated plainly, delivered without performance. The ambassador blinked. Her eyes shifted. I could see the color change even from 40 feet away, a ripple of something moving through the pale luminescence. Surprise, maybe, or recalibration, like she'd pressed what she thought was a soft spot and found something that didn't give. "Of course," she said after a beat, "lead on." And he did. I should tell you where we are because it matters. Conclave Station Muron is a diplomatic hub, one of the older ones, built in the early expansion period when the galactic conclave was still figuring out what neutral territory actually meant in practice. It's enormous. Think of a city that someone convinced to fold itself into a ring and float in orbit around a gas giant, and you're somewhere in the neighborhood. 7 kilometers in diameter. 43 docking bays. 17 distinct atmospheric zones for the 17 most common species types who use it. Everything from near-vacuum corridors for the Thessari to the dense, wet-haired chambers the Vaughn delegate always demands, and all of it layered on top of each other like a cake built by someone who'd never seen a cake, but had read a very detailed description of one. The central hub, where the summit reception was being held, ran at a compromise atmosphere. Slightly high oxygen for my tastes, slightly warm, smelling faintly of the mineral-rich ventilation fluid that the Delvari prefer. Lighting was calibrated for mixed-species vision, which meant it had this odd quality of being both too bright and too dim depending on which direction you were looking. The summit itself was the Muron Trade Accord's renewal, a 7-day negotiation between 11 species over resource extraction, rights in 3 contested star systems. I was there as an embedded correspondent for the Conclave Press Bureau, which is the kind of job that sounds impressive until you're actually doing it, and you realize most of diplomatic coverage is standing in corridors waiting for things to happen. Which is why, when things actually did start happening, I was paying close attention. The ambassador's quarters were on level 14, in the Delvari-configured section of the station. High ceilings, cool blue lighting, the faint hum of atmospheric processors that kept the air sharp and mineral clean the way Delvari biology preferred. Sergeant Reyes walked her through the whole level, exit routes, sensor coverage, the blind spots that the station's security grid hadn't quite managed to eliminate, the staff rotations, the nearest emergency seal points. She listened, or appeared to listen. I heard this part from Liaison Officer Priya Nantakarn, who was the diplomatic handler on the Conclave's side, and who became something like my primary source over the following days. Priya had been doing this job for 11 years, and she developed the useful habit of being somewhere nearby whenever anything interesting was happening. According to Priya, the ambassador spent most of the security walkthrough with the same faintly amused expression she'd worn at the landing ramp. Nodding at appropriate intervals, asking occasional questions that seemed designed more to test whether the human would fumble than to actually gather information. One of her attendants kept whispering in the melodic double register that Delvari use for private conversation, and Priya couldn't catch all of it, but she caught enough. Something about the Conclave's sense of humor. Something about surely a secondary assignment. Something about the species classification on file, and whether it had been updated recently. Sergeant Reyes answered every question, directly, completely, without any apparent awareness that he was being assessed rather than briefed, or maybe with complete awareness and a genuine inability to care. When he finished, the ambassador thanked him with a courtesy nod and walked into her suite. The door sealed behind her. Her lead attendant, a tall male Delvari named Assessor Vren, paused in the doorway and looked back at Reyes with the kind of expression that's hard to read across species lines, but that I came to understand as something in the neighborhood of pitying. "Your kind is new to the summit circuits," Vren said. It wasn't a question. "Human presence at Muron increases by about 9% each cycle," Reyes said. "We're getting there." "Yes," Vren said, just that, and then the door sealed behind him too. Reyes stood in the corridor for a moment, checked something on the slim data screen strapped to his forearm, made a note I couldn't see. And then he walked to his post at the end of the corridor and didn't move from it for the next 4 hours. Day 2 is when it started to get interesting. The summit's opening reception was held in the Grand Concourse, the largest open space on Muron, a circular chamber maybe 200 meters across with a vaulted ceiling of transparent composite that looked directly out into the gas giant's upper atmosphere. Clouds the color of bruised copper swirling outside, slow and enormous, lit from below by something we couldn't see. The effect was remarkable. Even for someone like me, who'd covered 3 previous summits and had technically seen it before, it was the kind of view that makes you stop for a moment and remember that you're floating in space, and the universe is vast and indifferent and beautiful. Approximately 200 delegates, attachés, correspondents, and station staff filled the concourse. The catering was managed by a Vaughan Culinary Cooperative, another compromise, since Vaughan food is edible by most species in attendance, though the humans I spoke to universally described the experience as technically nourishing. There was music coming from somewhere, a Thessari harmonic arrangement that operated mostly below the range of human hearing, but apparently produced profound relaxation responses in about 60% of species present. The lighting was low and warm and moved slightly, mimicking the cloud patterns outside. Ambassador Solen arrived 40 minutes into the reception, which is the Delvari way of communicating I am senior enough to be fashionably late. She moved through the room with the effortless authority of someone who has never once in her life doubted that other people would move for her, trailing attendants, and radiating that particular bone ridgelet luminescence that Delvari use as a status signal. Sergeant Reyes was 3 steps behind her left shoulder. He'd traded the tactical uniform for the formal Sec Corps dress code, same charcoal gray, different cut, collar buttoned to the throat, rank pins catching the light. Sidearm concealed under the jacket. Secondary weapon somewhere I couldn't spot. He moved through the crowded room exactly the way he'd stood at the landing ramp, constant, quiet assessment, every variable being processed, nothing wasted. I noticed because I was watching, because this was the kind of thing that had become interesting to me by now, that the other species in the room noticed him too. Not overtly, no one pointed, no one said anything, but there was this ripple effect whenever he passed near a cluster of delegates, a slight drawing back, a repositioning. The Kethalian quartet near the Eastern refreshment table, who were known for their territorial body language, shifted as one unit when Rays walked within 10 meters of them. The Vaughn delegates' personal security detail, 3 thick carapaced beings who carried themselves with the attitude of creatures who had never been seriously threatened by anything, tracked his movement with their secondary eyes while their primary attention remained forward. He was, by most objective measurements, the smallest security officer in the room. The Vaughn guards each outweighed him by 200 kilos. The Thessari contingent security had 4 arms apiece and molecular disruption sidearms that could reduce a bulkhead to component elements. Even the Delvari attendants were taller by half a meter. And yet, there's something about the way a certain kind of person moves through a room, a quality of presence that doesn't have anything to do with size. The Vaughn guards shifted because they felt it. I think this is just my theory for what it's worth. I think it's because most species evolved in stable, relatively predictable environments. Their threat assessment runs on familiar tracks. Big thing is dangerous. Known weapon is dangerous. Known aggressive posture is dangerous. They have categories for what to be afraid of. Humans evolved on a Deathworld, and whatever Sergeant Rays carried with him through that room, it didn't fit neatly into anyone's category. The ambassador didn't notice any of this, or she noticed and filed it under not relevant. She moved through the reception with the ease of long practice, greeting the consortium block delegates with the precise degree of warmth that conveyed we are allies, but I have not forgotten the Tarath negotiations, and the Vaughn ambassador with the measured cordiality of we share certain interests, and I will pretend not to notice your secondary agenda, and so on through the room's political geography. At some point, I checked the timestamp later. It was about 90 minutes into the reception. She paused near the center of the room to speak with Admiral Kethyorn of the Thessari Grand Fleet. The Admiral was an impressive being. 7 feet of geometric precision, exoskeletal structure gleaming blue-black, voice like resonant glass. The kind of creature that other species instinctively treat as significant. The two of them were in conversation for about 15 minutes. I was close enough to catch most of it, filtered through my translation earpiece. Trade route guarantees, escort protocols for the contracted transit lanes, the usual diplomatic music. And then from somewhere in the room, I still don't know who said it first, something got whispered. In the layered, slightly echoing acoustics of the Grand Concourse, whispers had a way of traveling. It reached me in fragments. A few words from a Kethalian delegate who'd been drinking the Vaughn mineral spirits a little enthusiastically. Half a sentence from one of the Thessari attaches. The full thing, finally, from Liaison Officer Priya, who happened to be standing next to me at that moment, and who turned to me with an expression I can only describe as carefully neutral. Someone just told Admiral Kethyorn that the human Sec Corps officer guarding the Delvari delegation is listed as a Terra Company veteran, she said quietly. I looked at her. Is that significant? She looked at me like I'd asked whether the gas giant outside the window was significant. Terra Company, she said. The Expeditionary Division. They're the ones who held the Braxis corridor during the Viren incursion. I knew the name. Everyone in the Conclave coverage pool knew the name. Braxis corridor was 3 years ago, a supply line held by a 200-person human unit against a sustained assault from Viren forces that, by most assessments, should have overrun them in 6 hours. They held for 19 days. Full story wasn't public, parts of it were still classified, but what had leaked was enough. He was there, I said. Listed on the Terra Company manifest, Priya said. Someone in the Admiral's intelligence staff found it. Across the room, Admiral Kethyorn had stopped speaking mid-sentence. She was looking at Sergeant Rays with her primary eyes, both of them unblinking, which for a Thessari is the equivalent of full, total, consuming attention. Ambassador Solen, mid-response, noticed the Admiral's distraction and followed the gaze. I watched her face change. The amusement was still there for a second, residual, habitual, and then it just didn't know what to do with what it was seeing. The Admiral's expression, the particular quality of stillness that had come over the cluster of delegates near the room's center, the way information moves through a crowd of politically sophisticated beings when someone drops something they didn't expect. The ambassador turned back to Sergeant Reyes. He was 3 steps behind her left shoulder, exactly where he always was. He was watching the room. He hadn't heard or appeared not to have heard or had heard and decided it didn't matter. She looked at him for a long moment. He didn't look back. He was scanning the exits. That night I filed my preliminary dispatch and then spent 3 hours digging through everything I could find on Terra Company, Braxis Corridor, and Sergeant Davin Reyes. The Braxis Corridor engagement is even partially declassified, even stripped of the operational specifics. One of those accounts that changes the temperature of whatever room you read it in. 212 humans, assigned to hold a resupply corridor that was considered strategically secondary, the kind of posting that exists because someone has to be there, not because anyone thought anything serious would happen. They were there for 4 days when the Viren incursion changed direction, and the corridor suddenly became the only viable resupply route for 3 separate conclave operations. The Viren sent roughly 4,000 soldiers on the first push. I'm going to let that sit for a moment. The surviving records describe the engagement over 19 days in terms that the analysts who compiled the report apparently struggled to categorize, not because the tactics were particularly exotic. Humans don't have exotic tactics. They don't have the biological advantages of the Thessari, or the regenerative capability of the Vaughn, or the hive cognitive tactical adaptation of the Kethalian. What they had was, and I'm quoting from an internal conclave military assessment document here, one that was partially declassified and that I obtained through legitimate channels, an apparent absence of the threshold response. Every species the conclave had studied, including several that made up the galaxy's most fearsome military forces, had a threshold response. A biological or cognitive ceiling on how much sustained stress, sustained fear, sustained damage could be absorbed before the organism sought escape. It was hardwired. You could override it with training, with drugs, with extreme circumstance. But it was there, and it set a practical limit on how long you could push a fighting unit before it broke. The humans at Braxis Corridor, according to that same assessment, operated past what the models predicted as their threshold for 19 days. What was even more disquieting to the analysts, apparently, was that the further past the threshold they went, the quieter they became. Most species become louder, more erratic, more desperate as they approach and exceed their limits. The Braxis unit became methodical, conservative, spare. Sergeant Davin Reyes was listed as the senior surviving officer by day 7, when 3 of his superiors had been killed, and 1 had been medically incapacitated. He was 28 years old at the time. By day 19, when conclave reinforcements finally broke through from the eastern corridor and reached the Braxis position, there were 141 humans still standing. Not all of them standing in the strictly literal sense. The field reports used the phrase combat capable, but present and functional. The corridor was intact. The resupply operations resumed within 6 hours. Sergeant Reyes' individual commendation, partially declassified, describes a specific incident on day 11. I won't recount it in full, partly because some details are still restricted, partly because what's available is already enough to make you set down whatever you're holding and sit quietly for a while. What I will say is this. On day 11, with a significant portion of his unit injured, with their defensive perimeter reduced to a fraction of its original scope, with Viren forces cycling in fresh rotations every 8 hours while his people had not slept in over a day and a half, Sergeant Reyes organized and personally led a counter-incursion into Viren-held territory. Not a defensive action, a counter-incursion, he walked toward them. The objective was a communications relay the Viren had established to coordinate their rotation timing. Disrupting it would create a gap. He took 12 people, the 12 he assessed as currently most capable, and went out in the middle of what was, by every rational measurement, an impossible situation, in the dark, into enemy-held ground. They disrupted the relay. They came back, all 12 of them. The gap it created bought the Braxis unit 37 hours, which was enough. And I think she's going to understand something by the end of this week that she didn't understand at the beginning of it. Day 3 of the summit started with what the station operations team initially classified as a calibration anomaly in Section C's atmospheric processing network. The official language always sounds so clean, doesn't it? Calibration anomaly, like something mildly inconvenient, like something that happens and gets noted in a maintenance log and gets fixed by a technician in a blue jumpsuit who apologizes for the inconvenience. What it actually was, and I didn't know this in real time, I pieced it together afterward, was a coordinated intrusion into Muron's atmospheric control grid. Not a dramatic intrusion, not the kind of thing that triggers immediate alarms. The kind of thing that someone with very specific technical knowledge could slide into the system like a hand into a glove, quiet and careful and deliberate. The target, as far as anyone has been able to determine, was the Delvari delegation's atmospheric zone on level 14. Specifically, a gradual, sustained reduction in the mineral compound content of the air supply, combined with a fractional increase in an inert compound that, at the concentration being introduced, would produce progressive cognitive impairment in Delvari physiology over 12 to 16 hours. Not a dramatic attack, nothing that would trigger biological emergency responses or cause immediate visible distress. Just a slow, quiet degrading of function. By the time anyone noticed, if they noticed, the ambassador would have been presenting information in treaty negotiations while operating at perhaps 40% of her normal cognitive capacity. It was clever, it was very, very clever. It would have worked probably, except for one thing. Sergeant Reyes took his coffee breaks in the atmospheric monitoring alcove on level 14. I should explain this, because it sounds almost too small to be significant, and in a way that's exactly the point. The alcove was a maintenance space, not a break room, not anywhere you'd expect a security officer to spend personal time. It was a gap between two processing units where a technician could pull readings from the atmospheric sensors without going to a central station. Small, utilitarian, lit by the blue glow of readout panels. There was a fold-down shelf that someone had at some point repurposed as a surface to put things on. Reyes apparently had started using it on day 1 because it had a direct sightline to the corridor outside the ambassador's suite, while also being a dead acoustic zone. Meaning you could sit in it and hear nothing from the corridor, which sounds counterproductive until you realize that it meant anything he heard coming from the corridor would be significant. Silence is its own kind of information if you know how to listen. He took 2 breaks there a day. Each one was 14 minutes. I know this because I asked him about it later and he remembered exactly. On the morning of day 3, he was in the alcove for his first break. He had his coffee, real coffee, not the synthesized kind. He'd apparently brought a supply from Earth because the station's options were what he described as technically coffee adjacent, and he was reviewing his threat assessment notes on the data screen. At some point, he looked up from the screen and looked at the readout panels on the wall. He looked at them for a while, and then he pulled up the atmospheric monitoring interface on his data screen and started comparing readings. I have to be honest, I don't know what he saw exactly or how he saw it. The technical details are beyond my expertise. When I asked him about it later, he explained it in terms I only partially followed. Something about the rate of change in the compound concentrations being fractionally different from the maintenance schedule baseline. Something about a signature in the deviation pattern that didn't match the natural variability profile. It wasn't a dramatic alarm. It was a number that was wrong by a very small amount, over a progression of readings, in a way that could only be detected if you were looking at the right data with enough background knowledge to recognize what you were seeing. I'd done an atmospheric surveillance course, he told me when I asked. 12 years ago, part of the Terra Company preparation curriculum, you learn to use the environment as a weapon and to recognize when someone else is doing the same. He flagged the anomaly at 8:47 station time. He also, before waiting for the security team's response, walked to the ambassador's suite, knocked on the door, and informed her, when a very irritated assessor, Vren, opened it, that the atmospheric conditions on the level were going to need emergency recalibration, and that he was relocating the delegation to the secondary suite on level 9 until it was resolved. Vren, according to Priya, who heard about this secondhand from the delegation's own internal reports, was not pleased. The secondary suite was smaller. The atmospheric calibration wasn't quite right for Delvari preferences. Moving would disrupt the ambassador's preparation schedule for the morning's negotiating session. "I understand," Sergeant Reyes said. "We're moving now." "I love that detail. Not I'm sorry for the inconvenience, or I know this is difficult, or as soon as we've confirmed the situation. Just, we're moving now." Vren tried to say something else. Reyes, apparently, simply moved to the interior of the suite and started, with complete professional courtesy and absolute inflexibility, organizing the relocation. They moved. Security investigation found the intrusion into the atmospheric grid 40 minutes later. Full analysis confirmed what Reyes had already identified. The concentration levels in the level 14 zone, had the delegation remained, would have produced measurable cognitive impairment in approximately 8 hours, right in the middle of the afternoon treaty negotiation session. Who did it? That's a longer story and not entirely resolved. The investigation pointed toward a factional interest within one of the less prominent delegations who had a specific stake in the outcome of the resource extraction negotiations, and who stood to benefit significantly if the Delvari ambassador was, without anyone realizing it, operating at substantially reduced capacity during a critical session. I can't name the faction here. The investigation is still technically active, but the sophistication of the intrusion pointed toward technical expertise that had been very expensively acquired. None of that was public on day 3. On day 3, what was public, to the small community of people present at the summit who always know more than the official statements, was that the Delvari ambassador had been relocated by her human security officer on what turned out to be a genuine threat, and that the threat had been identified not by the station's own monitoring systems, but by a Sec Corps sergeant on a coffee break reading atmospheric readout panels. I found out about it from Priya, who found out about it from her counterpart in the security division, who was simultaneously furious that his own systems had missed it, and, in the private way that professionals respect each other's work, quietly impressed. I went to find Sergeant Reyes to get a comment for my dispatch and found him in the relocated level 9 corridor standing at his post. Same posture, same quiet scan of the room, same absolute stillness. "Can I ask you a few questions?" I said. "No comment on active security matters," he said. "Fair," I said. "Can I ask you anything?" He thought about it for a moment. "You can ask, I'll tell you what I can." "Do you always use your brakes to review atmospheric sensor data?" The corner of his mouth moved, barely. If I hadn't been watching closely, I'd have missed it. "I use my brakes to stay useful," he said. Ambassador Solen heard the full threat assessment briefing that afternoon, after the security division had completed their initial analysis. I wasn't in the room, but Priya was. She was the conclave's liaison, which meant she sat in on everything. She described it to me afterward in the careful, considered way she described everything, like someone who has learned to observe without concluding too quickly. "The ambassador was very quiet through most of it," Priya said. "You know how Delvari luminescence works with emotional state. Her bone ridges were doing something I hadn't seen from her before. A deep sort of I want to say amber, which in Delvari isn't one of the standard emotional colors. It's a transitional shade, something between recognition and recalibration." "Was she grateful?" I asked. Priya considered. "I think she was processing something more complicated than gratitude," she said. She asked the security chief to confirm, twice, that the detection had been made by her assigned human officer, not by the station systems, not by her own delegation's monitors, by Sergeant Reyes personally on a break reading a panel. What did the security chief say? He confirmed it both times. And then, she asked that Sergeant Reyes be given a formal commendation in the conclave security record. The security chief said it was already being processed. She sat with that for a moment, and then she said, Priya paused, choosing the phrasing carefully, "Tell me about his service record." There it was. Someone, the security chief, or Priya herself, or whoever was in that room who had access to the relevant files, told her about Brax's corridor. The second time I saw them together, really saw them, in a way that felt like watching something important, was the evening of day 3. The summit had a scheduled break from formal sessions, and the delegates and staff were moving through the station's common areas. There's a long observation gallery on level 6, one of the original structural elements of the station, before the later additions were built around it. A corridor of maybe 300 meters with one entire wall of transparent composite facing out into space. The gas giant fills the lower half of the view. Above it, stars. Somewhere in the middle distance, the faint moving lights of a conclave patrol vessel making its scheduled pass. Ambassador Solène was standing at the gallery wall. Her attendants were clustered at the far end, giving her space. Delvari have a privacy convention around solitary contemplation that her staff respected. She was alone, or as alone as she ever was these days, which meant Sergeant Reyes was stationed maybe 8 meters behind her, at the intersection of the gallery and the side corridor. I was passing through and I stopped. I shouldn't have. It felt like watching something private, but I stopped anyway. The ambassador was looking out at the gas giant. The cloud light was moving slow and amber across the composite, painting her luminescence in shifting tones. She was still in the way tall creatures can be still, fully, completely, like something that has decided to be a monument. And then she turned slightly and said, not loudly, but in the gallery's acoustics clearly enough, "Sergeant Reyes, Ambassador, how long have you been doing this work?" A pause, just long enough to feel like consideration, not long enough to feel like reluctance. 14 years, counting the expeditionary period. 8 years in formal Sec Corps assignment. "Were you afraid," she said, "at Braxis?" He didn't answer immediately. I watched him from my position at the corridor junction. He was looking at the stars, or at a point somewhere between himself and the stars. "Yes," he said. "But you stayed." "Yes." "Why?" Another pause, longer this time. And when he answered, his voice was the same. Even, unhurried, that same quality of someone who has already decided not to perform anything, not to package his experience into something more comfortable or more impressive. "Because the people with me were staying," he said. "That's really the whole of it. You find out eventually that bravery isn't the absence of fear, it's just the decision you make when the fear is there." The ambassador was quiet for a moment. The cloud light shifted. The patrol vessel moved across the window and vanished. "My species," she said, "has a concept, Vethkalos. There is no direct translation, but the closest approximation would be the quality in a thing of being more than it appears." He didn't say anything. "I laughed," she said, "when I saw you at the landing ramp." "I know," he said. "I was wrong, too." "You didn't have sufficient information," he said. "Now you do." And that was the end of the conversation. She turned back to the gas giant. He turned back to the corridor junction. I stayed where I was for a long moment, feeling like I'd just watched something I was going to be thinking about for a very long time. I want to be careful about how I tell this part, because it happened fast and I was present for most of it, and my memory of it has that slightly overbright quality that things get when adrenaline is involved. I've gone back over my recordings and Priya's contemporaneous notes and the official security incident report, and I'm going to try to be accurate. The morning session of the summit was running long. The consortium bloc and the Vaughan delegation had gotten into a procedural dispute over the format of the resource extraction testimony phase, which sounds boring and is boring unless you understand that procedural disputes in conclave negotiations are often where the actual negotiations happen. The substantive positions get coded into process arguments, which means you fight about structure as a proxy for fighting about content. Happens every time. Everyone knows it happens. It still takes hours. Ambassador Solène was in the chamber working. She'd been composed and sharp throughout the morning, all the cognitive sharpness that the previous day's threat had not managed to blunt. And I'd caught glimpses of her from the press observation area, following the procedural dispute with the particular focused patience of someone who knows exactly what the real argument is about. Sergeant Reyes was outside the chamber. As protocol required, security personnel not cleared for the specific session content wait in the antechamber or immediate corridor, close enough to respond, far enough to give the diplomacy room. What happened at approximately 11:40 station time began in the corridor outside the 4th floor corridor, connecting the summit chamber to the level 4 common area. A Vaughan contingent, not the ambassador's personal staff, but a secondary delegation of what the conclave classifies as commercial observers attending the summit under the Vaughan Embassy's umbrella, had been using the level 4 common area as a secondary workspace. 3 of them, large, carapaced, moving with the slow certainty of species that are not accustomed to anything in their environment feeling threatening. They had commercial interests in the resource extraction negotiations. They had, apparently, formed the impression that private conversations with certain diplomatic staff about those interests, held quietly, without formal registration, in station corridors, were a reasonable approach to their situation. What they did not know, when they positioned themselves in the corridor at 11:40, was that liaison officer Priya Nantakarn, who had not been told about whatever they'd planned but who had impeccable timing, was walking in their direction. And what they had not adequately accounted for, when they decided that a conclave liaison officer traveling alone was an appropriate target for the kind of unsanctioned corridor diplomacy that walks a very close line with coercion, was that Sergeant Reyes was also in the corridor. 8 meters away, around a partial angle corner, out of their direct line of sight but well within audio range and certainly within response range. I was behind Priya by about 15 meters when it started. I'd been walking with her from the press area when she'd gotten a message that pulled her toward the summit chamber, and I'd been following, not wanting to lose my best source. The 3 Vaughn positioned around her were careful, technically. They didn't touch her. They didn't issue explicit threats. They used the commercial pressure language that has enough plausible deniability to survive a formal complaint. Expressions of deep concern about the negotiation trajectory, suggestions that certain outcomes would be viewed as problematic by interested commercial parties, implications that a person in Priya's position might find it useful to consider how certain information moved through certain channels. It was 3 large Vaughn in a corridor, and Priya was alone, and the tone was not friendly. I was moving forward, reaching for my communications badge, when I realized that Reyes was already moving. He came around the corridor angle smoothly and without apparent urgency, which sounds wrong but is exactly right. There was no aggressive posture, no display, no announcement. He just appeared. He positioned himself beside Priya, which completed a line, Priya, Reyes, wall that closed off the angle the Vaughn had arranged themselves in. "Liaison Officer Nantakarn," he said, addressing her but not taking his eyes off the Vaughn contingent. "Your presence was requested in the eastern antechamber." "Of course," Priya said. She'd had maybe 2 seconds to process his arrival, and she used them well, her voice steady. The lead Vaughn, the largest, with the distinctive copper-banded carapace of a Vaughn commercial sector elder, looked at Reyes. The look had that quality that very large creatures sometimes have when something smaller doesn't move out of their way, a sort of bemused reassessment. "The liaison schedule is her own," the elder said. "We were in conversation." "She's needed elsewhere," Reyes said. "Thank you for your time." The elder's secondary eyes, Vaughn have 6 of them, arranged in a lateral arc, used primarily for peripheral threat detection, moved to a fixed position on Reyes. I'd learned enough Vaughn body language by this point to recognize that as a stress response. Something had triggered the elder's secondary attention. "The human," the elder said, not to Reyes but to his 2 companions, in Vaughn's standard which my translation earpiece caught clearly, "is standing as if he is not smaller than us." "He is from Terra Company," one of the companions said, lower, a little wary. "I recognized him this morning." The elder was quiet for a moment. Something moved through the secondary eyes, a sequential blink, left to right, which in Vaughn is a sign of rapid reassessment. "Braxis Corridor," the companion said, just those 2 words. The elder looked at Reyes for what felt like a long time. Reyes looked back at him with an expression that could only be described as patient, not aggressive, not challenging, just here, present. Waiting for whatever decision you're going to make. The elder made a decision. He stepped back, 1 step, and then he moved his whole body aside in the classic Vaughn gesture of ceding the path. "Good day, Sergeant," he said. His conclave standard was formal and careful. "Good day," Reyes said. He walked Priya to the eastern antechamber and didn't look back. I found Priya 10 minutes later outside the antechamber. She was composed. Priya was always composed. But there was something around her eyes that told me she'd had a few minutes to process what had happened, and the processing had not been entirely calm. "Are you all right?" I said. "Fine," she said. "Professionally uncomfortable experience, nothing beyond that." She paused. "I want to be clear, they didn't touch me and didn't explicitly threaten me. The language was. I heard it, I said. I was there. Good, because the formal report is going to need a witness, and I'm glad it's not just me. The Voan elder backed down, I said. I've never seen Voan do that. I've been working this circuit for 11 years, Priya said. I have never seen a Voan commercial elder cede a corridor position. It doesn't happen. Their social architecture doesn't accommodate it. You'd have better luck moving a wall. She looked at me with that carefully neutral expression she used when she was about to say something she'd thought about. Whatever it is about Terra Company, whatever Braxis corridor means, it traveled. It reached places in this galaxy where I didn't expect it to reach. It's the Deathworld thing, I said. She looked at me. That's what they call it, right? Earth's classification, Deathworld. I searched for the right way to explain it, the way I'd been turning it over in my head since I'd pulled those records. It's not just that humans are tough. It's the category, what it means to come from a planet where everything is trying to kill you. Other species have warriors, they have trained soldiers, they have protective forces. But they evolved in environments with, I don't know, thresholds. Points where the environment told them back off, this is too much. Earth never told humans that. Earth just kept going, and humans kept going with it. Priya was quiet for a moment. I've been assigned to human delegations twice before, she said. I've read the standard species profile, but reading it and watching it are different things. She looked toward the corridor where the incident had happened. The Voan elder recognized Braxis corridor by name, a commercial elder from a Sector 3 transit hub, not a military contact, not a diplomatic specialist, a commercial elder. The word is traveling, I said. The word, she said, is spreading. Late afternoon, day 4. I had a conversation with Sergeant Reyes that I've been thinking about ever since. I found him in the atmospheric monitoring alcove. I'd worked out his break schedule by that point, which felt slightly intrusive but also felt like journalism. And he let me stay, which felt like a qualified kind of trust. I asked him directly about the Voan incident. I was doing my job, he said. The Voan elder stepped aside. Yes. Why do you think that happened? He was quiet for a moment, considering in that characteristic way of his, not performing consideration, actually doing it. I think they recalculated, he said. Because of Braxis corridor. Partly and partly because when you're in a situation like that, a territorial situation, you're running projections. What is this going to cost me? If I push, what happens? That calculation runs on what you know about the other party. If you know nothing about the other party, you default to physical parameters. Size, number, apparent capability. We were at a disadvantage on all three of those. So what changed? Information, he said. They got information. The information changed the projection. He thought about it for another moment. Most species, in my experience, are rational under pressure, Voan especially. They don't have the same attachment to pride at cost of pragmatism that humans sometimes have. When the projection changed, they updated. That's actually, and here's something that might have been the very distant cousin of a smile moved through his expression. In some ways, a more sophisticated response than pride would be. You're not upset that it's reputation rather than them actually being afraid of you specifically. Reputation is earned by the people who came before me. I'm carrying something that a lot of people paid a very high price for. That's not nothing. I'd rather it be used than not. I thought about that for a while. You don't seem, I don't know the right word, self-aggrandizing. Most people, if they'd survived what you survived. I didn't survive it, he said quietly. I mean, obviously I'm here, so technically, but when I say that, I mean, I'm not sure the right way to talk about something like that is survival. You go through something like that with people, and some of them come out the other side with you and some of them don't. The ones who don't, they're still there in whatever that place was. And you carry that. The whole experience, not just the part that has you in it walking around. He looked at the readout panels on the wall. I don't have a clean way to package it, he said. I've stopped trying. That evening, Ambassador Solen requested that Sergeant Reyes attend the informal delegation dinner. This was unusual. Security personnel don't attend delegation dinners. The protocol reasons are obvious. It creates social confusion, blurs the professional lines, complicates the dynamics of the gathering. Reyes apparently raised this concern. The ambassador apparently was not moved by it. He attended the dinner. I heard about it from 3 separate sources. The dinner was in the Delvari delegation's level 9 suite, 8 people at a table that had been reconfigured for mixed-species seating, Assessor Vren serving as a de facto host. The food was Delvari in character but moderated, the mineral compounds tuned down to a level that wouldn't cause discomfort in the human palate, which was itself a gesture that the Delvari don't make casually. Reyes sat at the end of the table, which was the position he apparently requested. It had clear sightlines to both entrances and the balcony access point, which was so perfectly in character that even Vren, according to my sources, had to suppress something. The conversation over 2 hours covered things that diplomatic dinners aren't supposed to cover. Not the treaty, not the summit positions, personal things, history, the kind of things that happen when barriers come down and the professional scaffolding gives way to something less managed. Someone asked Reyes what Earth was like. He described it, apparently. The specific part he described, and this is the detail everyone who was there mentioned independently, which is how I know it actually happened and wasn't embellished in the retelling, was the seasons. He was from a part of Earth that had 4 of them. He talked about winter. The way cold comes into a landscape not dramatically but persistently, gradually claiming the color from things until the world is pale and bare and still, and somehow more itself than it ever is in summer. The way ice forms on standing water, the way your breath makes fog in cold air. Nobody at that table, except one other human staff member present, had ever experienced seasons. None of them had stood in snow. None of them had known cold as something you could hold in your hand or watch on a window. He described it quietly, without performance, the way you describe something you know so well you can't be impressed by it anymore. But the listening, I'm told the listening around that table had a quality that doesn't happen often. That specific quality where a group of people are collectively in the presence of something that reveals to them how much of the world they haven't seen. Assessor Vren, who had, at the beginning of this week, whispered something about the conclave's sense of humor, apparently said, after a long, quiet moment, that Delvari had a word for people whose worlds had shaped them in ways that couldn't be fully translated. Vethkalos, the same word the ambassador had used in the gallery. Reyes asked what it meant. Vren told him, more than appears. The one who has been forged by what others couldn't survive. Reyes was quiet for a moment. And then he said, I know people like that, a lot of them. And then, after another pause, most of them didn't make it back. I should have been sleeping. I was not sleeping. The gas giant's light makes sleeping in the observation-facing quarters difficult. It doesn't go dark, just cycles through different shades of amber and copper and occasional deep red. And at 3 in the morning, when your body is already not quite right from the time displacement of space travel, the moving amber light through your window is a reliable way to stay awake while technically lying down. I was reviewing my notes, going over the sequence of things that had happened, and trying to find the shape of the story I was going to write. At 3:18, my communications badge signaled an alert from the station-wide emergency channel. Text only, quiet, the kind of alert that goes to all credentialed personnel on the station without triggering the station-wide audible that would wake every living being in all 17 atmospheric zones. Security incident in progress. Level 9, all non-essential personnel shelter in place pending clearance. I was out of my bunk and reaching for my recorder before I'd fully processed the words. What happened on Level 9 at 3:18 is reconstructed from the security footage and incident report, because I wasn't there in time to see most of it in person. I got there for the aftermath, but the footage and the report are detailed, and I've gone over them enough times that the sequence is as clear to me as if I'd watched it in real time. Approximately 20 minutes before the alert, at 2:57, 2 individuals in station maintenance uniforms accessed Level 9 through a service access junction that had been intentionally left unsecured. This was not a spontaneous or improvised act. The access manipulation had been prepared in advance. The maintenance uniforms were genuine, sourced from station supply, which meant either an inside contact or an extremely sophisticated logistics operation, and the investigation's current leaning is toward the former. Both individuals were carrying concealed disruption weapons, mid-range, civilian-grade, not military equipment but sufficient to incapacitate. Their destination was clear from their movement pattern. They were heading for the ambassador's suite. They made it to the Level 9 main corridor without triggering any alerts. The corridor was empty at that hour. The station's automated monitoring had been partially masked by what appeared to be a deliberate feed loop that had been inserted into the system at some point during the previous day, another piece of a prepared operation. What they had not accounted for was Sergeant Reyes' sleep schedule. He slept, by his own account, in approximately 4-hour rotational segments when on protective assignment. Not because he couldn't sleep longer, because 4 hours put him at the corridor at 300, which was his habit, and his habit existed because 300 is the specific point in most species' sleep cycles when cognitive and physical response times are most degraded. It is when attacks happen. The correlation between third watch incidents and 300 is consistent enough, in enough different operational contexts, that it had become a fixed point in how he structured his nights. He was at the corridor junction at 3:01. He heard the service access junction at 3:02. The sound wasn't loud, the panel opened smoothly. But Reyes, according to his own statement, had spent 11 minutes memorizing the ambient sound profile of level 9 on his first night. Every ventilator hum, every processor cycle, every frequency of the atmospheric equipment, specifically so that any deviation would be distinguishable. The service panel opened in a way that was distinct from its maintenance schedule opening frequency. Fractionally different, he noted it. He did not activate a general alert. He understood, he said later, that the most important thing was to establish what was happening before any alarm could change what was happening. If there was a person in that junction, or 2 persons, or 10 persons, he needed to know what he was dealing with before he gave them reason to make different decisions. He moved to a position that gave him observation of the junction exit without being in the direct sightline. He waited. The 2 individuals emerged. He assessed maintenance uniforms, civilian-grade body language, movement pattern consistent with intent rather than actual maintenance. The direction of movement toward the ambassador's suite, not toward any actual maintenance access point. He activated his communication to the Security Division Command at 3:03. One short signal, the prearranged alert pattern that meant threat in progress, my position, do not announce, respond quietly. Then he set his badge to silent. By 3:05, the 2 individuals had reached the midpoint of the corridor. Reyes had positioned himself between them and the ambassador's suite. He stood in the corridor. Just stood there. When they came around the final angle and saw him, and this is in the footage, clear and still, they stopped. He was standing in the center of the corridor, jacket open, hand at his side near the sidearm but not on it, just standing, looking at them. They made an assessment. I can almost see it happening in the footage. The assessment that the security monitoring had been handled. The assessment that a single human in a gray jacket is not a significant obstacle to 2 individuals with disruption weapons. The kind of assessment that is entirely reasonable given the surface-level parameters. One of them raised the weapon. What happened in the following 14 seconds is, honestly, difficult to describe in writing, and I've thought carefully about whether to try. The security footage exists, and it's as clear as it was going to get at 3:05 station time, which is clearer than you might think because the level 9 corridor lighting runs at high spectrum to compensate for the Delvari atmospheric zone's visual parameters. 14 seconds. He moved first. The weapon discharged twice and hit nothing because the thing it had been aimed at was no longer there. The second individual, who had a second weapon that wasn't raised yet, had the weapon not raised for approximately 2 seconds before it also became unavailable. Both individuals were on the floor of the corridor when the security response team arrived at 3:07. Both individuals were breathing. Reyes had deliberately left them breathing. This is worth emphasizing. Whatever he brought from Braxis corridor, whatever had been refined in 19 days of a situation that should have killed everyone in it, it included the capacity to be precise about outcomes. He needed them breathing because breathing people tell you things that inform future action. Both individuals were subsequently detained and transferred to Conclave security custody. Reyes filed his incident report with timestamps and precise detail before the security chief arrived on level 9. The security chief, a veteran Cathalian officer named Yessen, who had been managing Summit security for 7 cycles and had seen many things, read the report, reviewed the footage, and then apparently stood in the corridor for an unusual amount of time without saying anything. When asked about it later, Yeson described his response with the kind of direct specificity that Kethalian tend toward. I have reviewed approximately 400 incident reports involving physical confrontation in my career. Sergeant Reyes' report was the first one in which the responding officer had engaged two armed individuals in under 15 seconds without killing either of them, and had done so specifically, because he had calculated that keeping them alive would yield better information for protecting his principal. The level of operational precision required for that outcome, under those conditions, at that time of morning, is outside what I would have projected for any individual I've worked with. It is outside what I would have projected for humans as a class. I am updating my projection. Ambassador Solen was briefed at 400. I don't know exactly what was said. Priya was there, but she described it only in general terms, citing the sensitivity of the diplomatic record. What she did say was this. The ambassador listened to the full briefing. When it was finished, she asked one question. She asked, "Was he injured?" The security chief said no. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I want to see him." The meeting between Ambassador Solen and Sergeant Reyes, at roughly 4:30 on day 5 in the Level 9 secondary common room, was brief and was not recorded. Priya was outside the door and could hear muffled conversation but not specific words. When the door opened and Reyes came out, his expression was what it always was, level, present, undramatic. Priya said the ambassador, through the door she left open as she retreated to her private room, said one more thing as he walked away. Vethkalos. Just that word, said quietly to herself or to the room, not as a statement to anyone but as a recognition of something. Sergeant Reyes heard it. I know he heard it because I asked him later and he said yes. Did you know what it meant by then? I asked. Assessor Vren explained it at the dinner, he said. How did it feel to hear it? He thought about that for what felt like a long time. Like something I'd want to go back and tell the people who didn't make it, he said. That it meant something. That it was recognized. The summit's penultimate session. The treaty language had been laboriously, painstakingly assembled over 4 days of formal procedure and informal corridor negotiation, and all the complicated machinery that the conclave runs on. By day 6 it was close enough that the final details had that specific quality of fragility where everyone involved knows that one wrong word in one wrong moment can unravel weeks of work. Ambassador Solen was the lead Delvari voice in the morning session. I watched from the press observation gallery, a glass-fronted booth above the main chamber, sound transmitted in real time through translation filters. She was extraordinary. I don't say that glibly. She moved through the final points with a precision and confidence that felt almost effortless. And I thought about that atmospheric intrusion on day 3 and what it had been designed to blunt. And I felt something that wasn't quite anger but was adjacent to it. She had a sentence structure in Delvari that Priya, sitting next to me in the observation booth, described as the formal agreement cadence. A rhythmic construction that signals to other Delvari speakers in the room that the speaker considers the matter before them to be settled, concluded, finished. She deployed it 3 times in the morning session. The Muron trade accords renewal passed in principle by midday. The formal signing was scheduled for day 7. In the corridor outside the chamber, after the session broke, I saw something I want to record precisely because it was so unlike anything I'd seen in 11 days covering this summit. Ambassador Solen came through the chamber door. She was moving with that post-session energy that senior diplomats often carry, the compressed release of hours of sustained high-level attention, the body coming back online after a long period of pure mind. She stopped when she saw Sergeant Reyes at the corridor junction. He straightened, which was practically redundant. He was always straight, always precise. But there was something in the gesture, an acknowledgement. She walked to him directly, not past him to wherever she was going, to him. And she said, in conclave standard, formally and clearly, and without any of the complicated Delvari registration signals that usually layer her formal speech. On behalf of the Delvari delegation and personally, thank you, Sergeant, for your service this week. He inclined his head. The specific angle of the incline is the SecCorps formal acknowledgement of a principal's commendation. Ambassador. She held his gaze for a moment. Her bone ridges were doing that amber thing again, the transitional shade Priya had described, between recognition and recalibration. "I was wrong," she said, "about what I saw when I stepped off the transport. Ambassador, you assessed based on available information." "I assessed badly, there's a difference," she paused. "My people have a tradition. When we recognize Vethkalos in another, we record it in the formal register. The quality of being more than a parent. I would like, if you consent, to add your name to the Delvari diplomatic record in this capacity. It is not a conclave honor. It is a Delvari one. It means something specific to my species." Whatever Sergeant Reyes felt at that moment, he kept it in the place where he kept everything. His face did what it did, that controlled stillness that wasn't coldness but something quieter than warmth. "I consent," he said, "and I'd ask, if the record allows it, that the honor be shared, Terra Company, the people I served with." The ambassador considered this. "The record will note that the one recognized here represents a unit," she said. "That it carries a shared weight." "Then yes," he said, "with gratitude." That night, day 6 evening, the last informal gathering before the signing ceremony, the station had a kind of party. Not the organized, diplomatically formatted events of the preceding days. Something looser, less managed, the way long meetings end when the work is finally done and everyone can be a person again. The grand concourse, where the opening reception had been held, was rearranged. The Vaughan Culinary Cooperative had apparently put actual effort in this time. I stood near the observation composite and watched the gathering and tried to hold the whole week in mind at once, which is always impossible, but is always what you try to do. Admiral Kethyorn of the Thessari Grand Fleet crossed the room at some point and spoke with Sergeant Reyes for perhaps 20 minutes. I watched them from across the space, unable to hear. The Admiral, who was a full meter taller than him and whose exoskeletal structure gleamed in the festive lighting, was engaged, leaning forward slightly in the Thessari gesture of intent attention, both primary eyes fixed, the secondary array doing something I couldn't read at this distance. Reyes was doing what he always did, present still, engaged without performance. The Vaughan elder, copper-banded carapace, the same one from the corridor incident, was in the room. He saw Reyes at some point and made the path-ceding gesture from across the room, unprompted. Reyes acknowledged it with a nod. Neither of them spoke. Priya found me somewhere in the second hour and stood with me for a while without saying anything. "How does your dispatch look?" she said finally. "Confused," I said. "In a good way, I think." She almost smiled. "What's the story you're going to tell?" "I thought about it." "I'm going to tell the truth," I said, "which is that everyone in this room came in this week with a picture of what humans are. Small, soft, brief, new, and over 7 days that picture changed. Not because of anything dramatic, not because of— I searched for the right way to say it. Not because of performance. He never performed anything. He just did what he does, and what he does turned out to be more than anyone knew how to look at." Priya was quiet for a moment. Outside the composite window, the gas giant's clouds moved in their enormous slow patterns, orange and copper and deep bruised red. "There's a conclave intelligence briefing," she said. "Classified level, I shouldn't be telling you this, but it'll be declassified by the time the accords are signed. Aggregate species assessment of humans, updated after the Braxis engagement. The summary conclusion is," she paused. "The summary conclusion is that the initial Deathworld classification of Earth was accurate in terms of biological parameters, but that those parameters were significantly undervalued in the predictive models." "Meaning what?" "Meaning the species profilers ran their numbers and expected that a Deathworld origin would produce hardy, aggressive, territorial creatures. Dangerous in combat, straightforward in politics, useful in limited military contexts." She looked at me. "They did not expect this." A gesture toward the room. "The political sophistication, the restraint, she searched for it. The capacity to be both things at once. Both the thing that held Braxis Corridor and the thing that kept 2 attackers breathing because the data they carried was more valuable than the satisfaction of the outcome." "Why didn't the models expect that?" "Because on Earth," she said, "the same environment that made humans dangerous also made them adaptive. The Deathworld didn't just produce tough creatures. It produced creatures who had to be clever about being tough. You can't just be strong on a planet that has things stronger than you. You have to think. You have to problem solve. You have to," she chose the word carefully, "strategize your own survival, every day, across 100,000 years." She looked at Reyes across the room. He caught an atmospheric intrusion in an impossible way, not because of equipment or luck, but because he was using a maintenance alcove to practice situational awareness on his break. He stopped two armed individuals without killing them, not because he couldn't kill them, but because he calculated that keeping them alive served the mission better. He managed a diplomatic situation in a corridor with a Vaughn commercial elder without ever drawing a weapon or raising his voice. She shook her head. The model said, Deathworld, therefore blunt instrument. The reality says, Deathworld, therefore the sharpest knife in the drawer. The formal signing of the Muron Trade Accords renewal took place in the summit chamber at midday. 11 species, 11 signatories, the kind of moment that the Conclave press office generates press releases about, and that will appear in diplomatic history archives for centuries. I was in the observation gallery. I filed the formal dispatch about the signing and the standard account of the summit's outcomes, because that's the job and it needed to be done. But I also filed a second piece, a longer one, the one that had been building since the morning I watched a Delvari ambassador laugh at a small human standing at the bottom of an arrival ramp. I struggled with how to title it. I went through a dozen options. Finally, I kept it simple, because the simplest version was the true one. More than appears. The delegations began departing on day 7 afternoon. The docking bays were busy, the specific busy of endings, the complicated logistics of multi-species travel, all the practical machinery of going home. I had one last conversation with Sergeant Reyes. He was at the landing ramp, the same ramp where 7 days ago he'd stood while Ambassador Solen laughed. The ambassador's transport was being prepared. Her delegation was moving through final protocols. I asked him if anything about the week had surprised him. He considered that for a longer moment than usual. The atmospheric catch surprised me, he said. I didn't expect to need it. That's not what I meant. He knew it wasn't what I meant. Yes, he said finally, it surprised me. The recognition, not the professional commendation. I'm not talking about that. The recognition of something underneath the commendation. He was quiet for a moment. You do this long enough, you stop expecting to be seen. You do the job, and the job is the job, and what it costs is what it costs. And you don't really expect anyone outside of the people who were there with you to understand the weight of it. And this week, a Delvari ambassador asked me if I was afraid at Braxis, and she asked it like it was the question that mattered, not the outcome of the engagement, but the interior experience of the person going through it. He looked at the ramp. I've answered a lot of questions about Braxis, in briefings and assessments in the official record. Nobody had asked that one before. What did it feel like to answer it? Honest, he said, just that word. Ambassador Solen came down the ramp at that moment, moving through the final boarding protocols, attendants arranging around her, the organized departure that marks the end of something. She was not laughing. She moved with the composed, purposeful energy of someone finishing one large thing and already looking toward the next. She paused at the bottom of the ramp when she reached Reyes. A brief pause, formal but not cold. Safe travels, Sergeant, she said. Ambassador, he said. She started to move toward the transport. And then she stopped, turned back just slightly, and said in Delvari, which my translation earpiece caught in the register shift. That means I am speaking now without diplomatic coding, without formality, without the performance layer. They were lucky to have you, the ones at Braxis. He didn't answer immediately, the moment stretched. I was lucky to have them, he said. She held the look for one more moment. Amber luminescence, the transitional color, moving through her bone ridges. And then she turned and boarded the transport, and the ramp sealed behind her, and the docking bay began its departure sequence. I stood there for a while after the transport undocked. Watched the view screen as it cleared the bay doors and banked away from the station into open space, growing small against the gas giant's clouds, and then smaller and then gone. Reyes was still standing at the base of the now empty ramp. He'd pulled out his data screen and was doing what he always did, running the security protocols, closing the assignment, moving forward in the systematic and unhurried way that had characterized every minute of this week. After a while he looked up and saw me still standing there. You have what you need for your piece, he said. I think so, I said. He nodded, started to move away, and then he paused, which was unusual for him. He was not generally a pauser. Whatever you write, he said, Get the Terra Company names right. The ones who were at Braxis. There are 141 of us still here. There are 71 who aren't. He held the data screen briefly toward me, not close enough for me to read it, just the gesture of indicating its existence. I have their names on file, if you want them, for the record. I want them, I said. He transferred the file. I looked at it later in my bunk, with the gas giant's light moving amber across the ceiling. 141 names of people still alive. 71 names of people who were not, all of them from a planet called Earth, a Deathworld. The kind of world that doesn't care whether you're ready for it. That goes on doing what it does, sharp and indifferent and vast and alive, and produces, across 100,000 years of that going, something that the rest of the galaxy is still learning how to see clearly. I read every name. I kept reading until the amber light from the window shifted and deepened, and the gas giant turned slowly in its orbit, and the station turned with it. And somewhere in the galaxy, a Delvari ambassador was carrying a word in her diplomatic record that she'd never applied to a being outside her own species before. Vethkalos. More than appears, the one forged by what others couldn't survive. I filed my dispatch the next morning, not the formal summit piece that had gone in on day 7. This was the other one, the longer one. It ran to about 12,000 words by the time I was finished, which is long for the kind of outlet I was writing for. The editor called me before publishing to ask if I was sure about the length. I'm sure, I said. There's a lot of detail about one security officer, he said. We covered the summit itself in 3,500 words. The summit is the frame, I said. This is the picture. He published it. The response, I mention this not out of vanity, but because it matters to the story, was larger than anything I'd written before. Not because of my writing, because of the thing I'd written about. Because somewhere in the galaxy, across 111 member species of the Conclave, and all the various media circuits and diplomatic correspondence channels, and intelligence briefing summaries that things travel through, the account of 1 week on Conclave Station Muron was reaching people who needed to understand something they hadn't quite understood before. The piece got picked up, and then picked up again. And then I started receiving correspondence from species contact liaisons in offices I'd never heard of, asking for extended comment, additional detail, the full Terra Company name list, which I published separately with every name spelled correctly because I'd promised. 3 months later, Assessor Vren, through official Delvari diplomatic channels, sent me a message. It was formal, correctly registered, routed through the Conclave Press Bureau. It said, "The ambassador requests that you be informed. The formal Delvari record of Vethkalos' recognition, registered to Sergeant Davin Reyes, and by his own request, extended to represent the unit designation Terra Company, Braxis Corridor Engagement, has been entered in the Delvari Diplomatic Archive. It will remain there in perpetuity. The ambassador also requests that you convey the following to Sergeant Reyes if your contact with him remains active. She has thought about what he said at the observation gallery. She has thought about the part where he described why he stayed. She believes she now understands, in a way she did not before, what 'because the people with me were staying' actually means. She does not think she has a word for it in Delvari. She is considering whether a new word is needed." I forwarded the message to Reyes. He replied in under an hour. The message was short, which I should have expected. It said, tell her she already found the word. Vethkalos, it was always big enough to hold it. I think about that week a lot. I think about the laugh at the landing ramp, bright, unguarded, certain of itself. The laugh of someone who looked at a human in a gray jacket and thought they knew what they were seeing. I think about the 14 seconds in a corridor at 3:05. I think about the name file on the data screen. I think about cold air and breath turning to fog and seasons on a planet that doesn't give anything away. I think about what it costs to come from a death world, what it means to carry that, to carry not just the toughness of it, but the wisdom of it, the specific sharpening that happens when your environment has spent 100,000 years insisting that survival is a problem you have to solve creatively or not at all. I think about the Voan elder stepping back in a corridor, the Admiral's 2 primary eyes held fixed in full attention, the amber light moving through Delvari bone ridges in a transitional color that doesn't have a settled name. I think about 141 people who are alive and 71 who are not, and the file on a data screen that holds them all together in the same place. And I think about what Ambassador Solène said, the last thing she said, at the bottom of that departure ramp, in the uncoded register that doesn't have a performance layer. They were lucky to have you. And what he said back. Not thank you, not I did my job, not the version that centers himself. I was lucky to have them. That's the thing about someone who has actually been through something. They know exactly where to put the weight of it. They know exactly who it belongs to. Humans are small, in the scale of this galaxy. Brief lives, limited reach, one small planet in an unremarkable sector, new enough to the conclave circuits that some of the older species still look at them the way Ambassador Solène looked at the bottom of that ramp, with the bright, certain amusement of someone who has already decided what they're seeing.